September 14th, 1952. The Quiet Man, starring John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, premieres to American audiences. John Ford's depiction of Ireland portrays the country as a lush meadow, awash in serenity. Its people are simple and somewhat narrow-minded, but hardworking and friendly. Disputes are settled not with diplomacy, but through the ancient Irish traditions of fighting and drinking. For many, it would be quite easy to take this movie at face value, to see Ireland as a quaint haven, oblivious to the troubles of the outside world, is especially tempting for those who have never set foot there. For Irish audiences, however, there was a sly subtext running through the film that did not go unnoticed.
Hey, is that real? She couldn't be.
Ah, nonsense, man. It's only a mirage brought on by your terrible thirst.
One of the few consistencies in the portrayal of Ireland's identity in media has been inconsistency. There is a constant battle between spearheading a contemporary cosmopolitan aesthetic and preserving traditional values. While many of the images you see on screen are overtly familiar to anyone living in Ireland, there's often a strong urge to dismiss this representation as a romanticised commodification of our culture. The way this translates on screen has been discussed at great length and becomes a hot topic every time an American movie featuring bad Irish accents surfaces. But today, we're going to look at how Ireland, and Irishness in general, is represented in a different medium.
Hello, Father. Playing the old computer game there?
So far, interactive media hasn't been given the same level of critical attention as film when exploring cultural or socio-political landscapes. Video games are still young, but they're not that young, and certainly not so naive that potential problems in representation shouldn't be taken into account. Irish characters in games are often lazily used to instill certain elements that the writers feel the plot requires. Religion or spirituality for the fantasy games, deceit and deception in action games, comedy in pretty much everything else. The Irish are a convenient stereotype that lend themselves well to classic storytelling. There are occasional exceptions to these rules, but not enough to change public opinion. So let's look at some more personal stories here. Let's enter the Animus and go to the Emerald Isle itself. Ireland as a location is rarely seen as a setting in games, and if it is, it's almost never the primary location. Ireland is, almost exclusively, a place for the main character to travel to, a separate location. In some cases even DLC, just to emphasize the point further. Most of the games shown in this video were developed by American or British development teams, so that does make a lot of sense. Despite the world becoming an increasingly globalized village, Ireland retains a strong sense of character. If you're going to portray it on screen without an intimate knowledge of its culture, it's better to do it in a way that doesn't make assumptions. let the player discover this world in a new and unfamiliar way. In the DLC for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, our main character travels to Ireland in order to straighten out a political entanglement between the kings of the time. It's an immediately engaging premise, allowing the player to leisurely explore the rich cultural and political landscape in a game that boasts a sensational amount of detail and deft touches. Irish dancing makes an appearance before giving way to a casual punch-up between our character and his nephew. Commonly used Irish phrases are dotted throughout conversations, and even the depiction of the poetress is a historically accurate one. But despite this admirable setup, Assassin's Creed does eventually fall into the trap that so many other games set in Ireland do. You see, the unfamiliarity of Ireland in the general mainstream promotes it as a mysterious and spiritual location. It's a place where ghosts and goblins hoard ancient trinkets and cast their dark magic on any of those unfortunate enough to step over its threshold. And while Assassin's Creed initially looks to subvert that trope, the draw of the occult ultimately proves to be too strong. The cause of our hardship is not political unrest nor societal ills, no. It is the work of the mystic druids and their pagan gods. Again. It might gloss over the complexities of an entire nation, but this is a classic example of writers playing to the strength of location. Ireland has one of the highest densities of castles in all of Europe, which is a rigid staple of both fantasy and horror. Compared to England, which has a total of 4,000, Ireland has a staggering 30,000 castles and castle ruins, dotted around its comparatively smaller landscape. With that in mind, it's hard to deny its suitability for the fantasy genre. Churches also play a massive role here. It's no secret that religion makes up a considerable part of Irish identity. Even the most outspoken atheists will often belie an Irish Catholic upbringing in some form or other. But how does this translate to the medium of games? Let's take a look back at a game from the 90s that managed to feature Ireland in a surprising and remarkably intelligent way. Broken Sword: Shadow of the Templars was released in 1996 and developed by British game developer Revolution Software. The game is a point-and-click adventure in which the main character, George Stobart, travels to various countries across the globe in order to unravel a conspiracy. It was well received upon release by critics, many of whom praised the atmosphere and creative storytelling. After Paris, France, the second location that the player travels to is a small village in Ireland. When I first heard this music playing on arrival to this section, my eyes almost popped out of my head from rolling so hard. At first glance, a lot of the things we see on screen here suggest that this is a very bare bones and lazy attempt at portraying my home country. That's certainly how I remembered it when I first played it. It's pointedly rural. There's a great big castle dominating the town, and the first character you meet is even whistling "Too-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra." But revisiting this section left me pleasantly surprised. Not unlike The Quiet Man, this game section is brimming with smart subversion and pointed direction. Characters knowingly mock George, playing up to his expectations of what Irish people are like. Every time he thinks he has a handle on the local customs, they pull the rug out from under him. Casual comments and jokes are made, many of which tease a surprisingly adept commentary of Irish life. It only takes a few minutes to establish that this is an Ireland that will happily let you fall into the trap of underestimating it. Those invested in the main story, and who are maybe unfamiliar with Irish culture, might breeze past it, but there's a lot here to uncover. It's worth noting that this area consists entirely of the castle, for mysticism, and a pub, for the crack. All but one NPC can be found hanging out in or near the pub. And the last one only requires a little persuading to get him going. This is almost problematic, but it is worth noting one important thing. none of these characters are actually drunk. It's a common trend to portray Irish characters as drunken idiots in the media, just waiting to start a fight, gamble, or act the maggot. A classic example of this can be seen in Red Dead Redemption with the character unsubtly known as Irish. He's clumsy, he seems untrustworthy, and he is perpetually intoxicated, which leads to trouble on more than one occasion. This is the most cynical portrayal of the Irish drunkard, an unfortunate byproduct of Irish pub culture. This isn't a wholly inaccurate portrayal, but it has become so common that it has skewed the overall portrayal of pub culture. The pub, despite birthing this unfortunate depiction, is still an important mainstay in Irish culture. It would be hard to find a single Irish person who would say otherwise. Broken Sword pulls off the impressive feat of incorporating the pub into its narrative without being exploitative. It respects the institution enough to get some humour out of the situation, but not at the expense of the Irish people themselves. The pub, from an Irish perspective, is simply a microcosm of passion and life in its purest form. Having said that, Ireland's attitude towards death is another interesting facet worth discussing when talking about cultural mainstays. Ireland has historically had a very unorthodox approach when it comes to grieving for loved ones. Funerals are, of course, quite somber affairs, but it's not unheard of for them to transition into lively celebrations of life that are rooted in respect for those who have passed on. Again, religion is the culprit here. One of the central pillars of Catholicism is that of the afterlife. If you are a good person on earth, you can make your way into heaven. Collectively, this is something that we are taught at a very early age and with a completely straight face. Irish public schools and the Catholic Church are very much intertwined, with many schools having classes dedicated to religious studies. As children, it's difficult to contest these theological opinions when they are being fed to us by adults, who we often assume are right on the simple basis of them being adults. The idea is implanted into our minds, and it's difficult to shake, forming a not insignificant part of our psyche. We often see people of older generations speaking about, or even to, loved ones who have passed on, as if they were in the room. It's all perceived as very casual, as though the relationship between the living and the dead is not so different than that of friends living in two different towns. This laid-back attitude might go some way towards explaining why Ireland and horror don't mix as well as people might expect. Until I researched for this video, it had always been a bit of a mystery to me why Ireland, with its rich history of the occult and folklore, has struggled so much with horror in film. Irish horror movies have a rich tapestry of tradition to pull from. We've seen changelings, fairies, and banshees portrayed on screen, and yet we never seem to be able to stick the landing on any of these stories. My theory, as I said before, is that we simply don't fear these elements in a stereotypical manner. The way myth is incorporated into contemporary life isn't easily explained. We don't regard the supernatural with the reverence you may have seen in some Hollywood movies. But that isn't to say we are completely dismissive of these superstitions either. It's less a fine balance and more a continuous seesaw that rocks side to side under social and cultural impacts. That rhythm doesn't translate well to the traditional Hollywood format, which requires a level of stability if it wants to stand the test of time. Despite that, we have continued to construct our genre movies in this way, and the results are rarely spectacular. It speaks volumes that two of the best Irish horror films I've ever seen involved a stalker in the woods and a healthy dose of aliens and comedy. Horror games set in Ireland don't fare much better, and for much the same reason. Clive Barker's Undying is probably the most obvious attempt at this, and it's not a terrible game in and of itself. Patrick Galloway is our main character, and he comes to Ireland because his old friend Jeremiah Covenant needs his help in getting rid of the ghosts that are haunting the estate. Being a first-person shooter, the most obvious solution to this problem is bullets. It uses the Unreal Engine 1, and for the time, it was pretty atmospheric. NPCs wander around the hallways and make fearful little comments about strange sightings in the mansion, a nice little touch that not many games of the time would have bothered with. There are even some scripted set pieces that might have been scary at the time, but I found it all very quaint. It would be unfair of me to point to the fact that this game was set in Ireland, and that it's not scary for that reason. I'm not going to do that though. I think it's not scary because it was made in the year 2001 and most games of that era hadn't really figured out how to scare players yet. I'd be very surprised if there were more than 10 games released at this moment in time that I could point to and honestly say that they were true horror experiences. There are still a few though, so Undying doesn't get off the hook. Before I break it down, I think it's worth highlighting the relationship the Irish characters have with the dead here. Patrick encounters several deceased members of his friend's family during his little adventure, and he treats almost every one of them like a strange dog that's wandered into his garden. He may as well be holding a mug of tea and a biscuit during these moments for all the tension that's in it. It doesn't help that some of the scripted set pieces are startlingly reminiscent of the first Harry Potter game, which released on the same engine and in the same year. Again, I think it would be foolish to assume these scenes lack tension because they are set in Ireland. But it's interesting nonetheless that it worked out that way, and that the characters conform to that behaviour whether it was intentional or not. The best thing the game actually has going for it is its atmosphere, which I would never accuse Ireland of lacking in. There's a big, ominous manor house, some dilapidated ruins, and a pretty iconic cliff to explore, and all of these locations feel great to play in. The gameplay is at odds with the mood, however. First-person horror shooters are a tricky subgenre to get right. They typically rely on twitch gameplay, and there's only so long that mood can be maintained before the horror gives way to an action mindset. To my mind, only 1 or 2 games have really managed to pull it off, and even then, only just barely. Undying makes a pretty admirable attempt. That NPC banter I mentioned earlier goes a long way, but it's not nearly enough to elevate it. Don't worry though, I'm not finished yet. Folklore is a game that was released in 2007, and I've often felt it was tailor-made specifically for me. It's set in rural Ireland, has a big focus on story, really fun moment-to-moment gameplay, fantastic character design, and an atmosphere you could cut with a wooden spoon. It was published by an independent Tokyo-based studio called Game Republic, but despite the distance between locations, they managed to weave some of the best aspects of Irish culture into a game that was already pretty solid. Before I continue, I should probably mention that while Folklore received generally favourable reviews on release, it ultimately sold quite poorly. At the time of writing, a second-hand copy of the game can be bought for just under €100, a price that suggests not many copies of the game were made, but neither is there a high demand for it. This is a real shame because I think it's well worth any player's time, and I also think the developers deserve their proper dues for making such a great little title. The game focuses on 2 characters, Ellen and Keats, both of whom arrive in the small seaside town of Doolin. Once again, we see Ireland being approached from the outside and yet again by boat, because planes just aren't mysterious enough for the land of ghosts and fairies. I find it especially interesting that Ellen does this, because the letter she receives clearly says Dublin on the envelope, and her accent is very obviously supposed to be an Irish one. Despite the fact that our main character is Irish and already living in Ireland, the developer still feels the need to show her arriving from across the sea, just to maintain the oblique status Ireland has in the eyes of the average player. I want to make it clear, this isn't a gripe I have with the game. I just think it's really funny. The game does a much better job at conveying Ireland's relationship with the dead than Undying does. NPCs confirm the existence of spirits simply by virtue of believing in them. Much like Broken Sword, though, everything is said with a sly little grin. It's as though the characters genuinely do believe in these otherworldly spirits, but they don't fancy your chances of encountering any of them, because you're an outsider who doesn't respect the ancient rituals, or some other bollocks. It's ironic then that not only do Ellen and Keats see the fairies, they join them for a few pints and almost overthrow the entire undead kingdom. My love for Folklore could almost be described as patriotic. It sells a mood I've found other games to be sorely lacking, with the possible exception of Broken Sword. One of my favourite moments in the game, which happens again and again, is this part here. You're probably wondering what the hell I just showed you, and the short answer is atmosphere. First of all, we have to understand the context. Every night, Ellen and Keats need to go to the pub to learn more information about the mystery they're trying to solve. They never quite know who or what they're going to find there, but there's an unspoken agreement between the developers and the player that it won't involve anything too taxing. Folklore is a game of two halves, and while the Netherworld is very gameplay heavy, the village of Doolin is very much focused on mood setting and information gathering. It prioritizes pacing and allows it to ebb and flow naturally. Complementary to that end, the audio is well implemented and with purpose. The soundtrack manages the delicate balancing act of being quite soothing but also a little mysterious, like an unfamiliar lullaby. The music in Folklore overall is really something quite special, and I'd recommend it to anyone. The rustling of grass is a lot louder than footsteps on stone, and there are other subtle sounds of nature in the background that blend well into the music. The lighting does a lot of heavy lifting here too. It's not quite nighttime at this point, more like early evening or twilight, but it's still dark enough so that the streetlights feel comforting when contrasted against the dim background. Again, the game makes the smart choice not to lean too hard into horror territory simply because that wouldn't work here. The pub itself takes pains to seem warm and inviting also. Finally, the general iconography of what we see here is just incredibly spot on. I'm not saying this is what every small Irish town looks like, but rather that the way this looks evokes the way Ireland feels. The out-of-use phone box, the steel wire fences, the unruly grass on the road, the stone walls, the wheelbarrow in the garden, even the shape of the roadside. Alright, you know what? There's a small chance I'm just being nostalgic, but I'd like to extend an invitation to any Irish viewers here. Let me know in the comments if I'm crazy, or is this really as spot on as I think it is? Anyway, as I said before, the game is divided into two halves, and the Netherworld is where the more gamey part of the game actually happens. It's here that we see the Japanese sensibilities take hold, as we essentially engage in Celtic Pokemon, kidnapping fairies to use in battle and basically solving other people's problems for them in exchange for more information. It's a little strange that in this game about fairies, this is the part I find less interesting overall. It still does a decent job, the creature designs are what really sell it for me, but I feel like the Irish spirit in these sections is more or less lost and replaced with something considerably more Japanese. I don't have any problem with a Japanese approach generally. I wouldn't be living in Japan right now if I did. But this is a market that is already saturated with Japanese games, and I'd hope the feeling of Irishness could have pervaded for just a little longer. I know it's unfair for me to expect a Japanese developer to flawlessly depict the Irish experience through their game, but they do such a good job in the Doolin sections, I can't help but be disappointed that they drop the ball when it comes to the Netherworld. In my opinion, this again comes back to the Irish people's casual attitude towards spirits and the dead, and how that's depicted with such informality in their day-to-day life. As soon as the ghost stories or fairy tales are depicted in a more conventional way, such as here, where the game becomes a more traditional, arcadey experience, something is lost. Folklore is at its best when its sense of mystery is invisibly weaved into the everyday. I've talked a lot about spirituality, magic, and ghosts, but now it's time to look at the more contemporary, cosmopolitan side of Ireland. No? Oh, maybe. Oh, this is actually Dublin. You can't see it, but yeah, see that there? That's Dublin. Here, that's not it. Okay, so this looks bad. I know what you're thinking. Ireland doesn't have a modern contemporary setting. Well, yes and no. What you need to understand is that when designing a game and selecting a location for it to be set in, you need to play to that location's strengths. And while there's nothing wrong with the cities of Ireland, it's difficult for developers to not think to themselves, hey, what about London? Seeing as they're on this part of the map anyway. Ireland has castles and romanticism in spades, but we don't compare favourably to London when it comes to sprawling cityscapes and potential for high-stakes drama. One of the few examples where contemporary Ireland is utilised is Siphon Filter 3. In it, there is one level in which Gabe Logan fights members of the IRA on the Dublin Docklands, and I don't even know where to begin dissecting that one. Being a PlayStation 1 action game, it's not outside the realms of possibility that the American developers looked up Ireland and terrorist, slapped the results in the villain folder of their game, and called it a day. I think I could almost dismiss this for the simplistic early 2000s action trope that it is, if it weren't for the culturally insensitive way that Gabe takes the IRA members out. This is a moment in gaming history that needs to be addressed. On the one hand, yes, I do believe that games can be a powerful storytelling tool, and that they are culturally relevant. I think that with proper poise and respect, almost any topic can be explored in interactive media to provoke intelligent discussion. It's a popular medium, and popular media, regardless of how you feel about it, is an excellent way to bring important issues into the cultural consciousness. That said, what we're seeing here with Siphon Filter 3 is a perfect example of how interactive media should not be utilised. Bear in mind that this is a game that released in 2001, just 3 years after an event in which 29 people were killed in a car bombing orchestrated by members of the IRA. And yet despite that, blowing up vans driven by IRA members is given about as much weight as blasting imps in Doom. All the games mentioned in this video so far have been developed by non-Irish developers, and considering we've been talking about Irish representation here, that's a pretty massive problem. Odds are, most people don't know of any games made by Irish developers, and that's understandable. Games like The Last of Us aren't being developed in Ballybrack. What you might not know is that the Irish independent gaming scene is absolutely thriving, with some really interesting titles that work towards establishing an identity in the Irish landscape. The Little Acre, developed by Pewter Games, managed to make its way onto modern consoles in 2016, and despite the length and pacing being somewhat crippled by its budget, it has a lot of character, bolstered by its charming art style. In its relatively short runtime, it manages to make a commentary on the Ireland-specific notions of family, classism, death, romanticism, and our old friends, the fairies. It isn't as clever as Broken Sword when it comes to depicting the Irish people, But it is a lot more sincere, and that's something games about Ireland have been lacking. Afterlife, A Story of a Father, is a free-to-play game by Green Sawdust, and it really knuckles down on what I mentioned earlier about the Irish having a familiar attitude with the deceased. In it, you play as Rick Dennehy, a man who died in the 90s and decides to return to Earth to see how his loved ones are dealing with his death. It's perhaps a little more melodramatic than I would like, but the casual way Rick speaks to his fellow ghosts is strikingly Irish in design. It's exactly the sort of mood I was chasing when I played the Doolin segments of Folklore. Not every game developed in Ireland aims to depict Irish culture. In film, a lot can be deduced about a country from the consistent styles, tropes, or themes used by its filmmakers. If the same is true of Irish games, what does our development style tell us? First and foremost, the work of one Terry Kavanagh cannot be ignored, as he is probably the leading auteur in the Irish game market. An independent but prolific developer, he has dozens of independent titles under his belt. He is most well known for the games VVVVV and Super Hexagon, both of which offer a minimalist graphical style and simplistic but highly addictive gameplay. Both games offer little in the way of story. Super Hexagon has none at all, but there is consistency in the design that offers some insight. Both games take a pointed and deliberately simple approach. VVVVV is a platformer without a jump button, but the pilot can traverse by manipulating gravity and falling. Super Hexagon's only gameplay mechanic is maneuvering a tiny triangle around a fixed circular path, but the player needs to react incredibly fast while dealing with psychedelic visuals. He takes a genre model seen in countless games before it and makes it interesting by restricting actions further and streamlining the core gameplay loop. If these games utilized all the features we typically see in games of the same genre, they would have faded into obscurity. The Dark Side Detective and its sequel, A Fumble in the Dark, are a pair of unusual little point-and-click adventure games developed by the Irish developer team Spooky Doorway. Much like Terry Kavanagh, they take a genre we're familiar with and streamline the gaming experience by aggressively trimming the fat. The games follow the adventures of the titular Darkside detective, Francis McQueen, and his bumbling partner, Patrick Dooley, as they solve paranormal cases in the town of Twin Lakes. They eschew a traditional overarching narrative in favour of a mission-based structure, giving the players cases they can usually solve within an hour of playtime. The result is a game that flows better than your average point-and-click, giving players a sense of progress as they tick off cases on their to-do list. It also helps that the game has a pleasingly nostalgic atmosphere, retro-mining films like Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice for reference. The pixelated characters deliberately lack facial features in a knowing nod to games of the era, and an 80s synthwave soundtrack ties the whole package together. The only area in which the games fall down is in their lack of warmth, a result of the game's structure and genre. These are comedy games first and foremost, and while you might not engage with them on an emotional level, they do at least deliver on some truly excellent comedy. None of these games could really be called AAA. The fact is, there aren't a lot of those in Ireland. Only 2 games come even close to achieving that status, and even then, I would say that they are AA games at best. The first is Star Trek Fleet Command, a mobile game that doesn't do anything exceptional, but doesn't seem to have done anything wrong either. There have been a vast number of mobile games developed in Ireland for iOS and Apple devices, but let's face it, that's probably true of any country, and I don't want to dwell too much on games that probably won't make much impact. Star Trek is a well-known franchise, however, and deserves mention purely for the fact that it's a niche game that hit its mark. The other game worth mentioning is Empire of Sin, which not only released on PC, but also on PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. While this is undoubtedly the most noteworthy game developed in Ireland from a commercial point of view, it was also developed by the American developer team Romero Games, and I'm not really sure if it can be included because of that. The game itself focuses on Prohibition-era Chicago, with players controlling mob bosses in order to expand their empire. It follows a formula that's been seen before and received mixed reviews upon release. There could very well be something to say about the role the Irish mob played during this time and how that is depicted in-game, but because it doesn't come from the perspective of the Irish themselves, it will probably just remain a side note. What else is there to say about these games? What do they say about us as a nation and culture? If there is anything to be taken from this video, it's that despite the affection we have for certain tropes and genres, we refuse to be easily defined. Even at our most traditional, there is a sense of schizophrenia, an unwillingness to commit to a single design ethic. And with all that said, allow me to introduce to you my absolute favourite Irish game to be developed in recent years. The Haunted PS1 Demo Disc. A collaboration of multiple game developers from around the world, this project was organised by Breoghan Hackett, who, with a name like that, is very obviously Irish. They gather a bunch of short horror experiences, all of which emulate the PS1 style of horror games, and packages them together in a format that couldn't be more bog standard. This is such an insanely brilliant concept, I can't believe no one had thought of doing it before. When I talked about Undying, I made a point of saying that I don't think outright horror meshes well with Irish sensibilities. This is still true, and I think that this game communicates that better than any game that's come before it. The very existence of Haunted PS1 Demo Disc shows that it is poking fun at itself. Almost every word in that title is subversive in some way or form. It's not made for the PS1. Most of the games aren't demos at all. And it's not a physical disc. The word haunted is the only word that doesn't immediately contradict. But because it's attached to a product so inherently odd, I feel as though it strikes the perfect balance between the strange and everyday. The games themselves aren't really the reason this collection is special. It's the way it's packaged by Hackett themselves. It shows they have a strong connection with the notion of death and the afterlife. Every game included is a horror game after all, but their acknowledgement of its banality speaks volumes. They have since released a follow-up, the Haunted PS1 Demo Disc 2021, as well as 2 Haunted PS1 Christmas Advent calendars, all of which are free and will be included in the description below. I highly, highly recommend them. Ireland hasn't had a strong presence in gaming up until now, and I suspect that it will continue to struggle for some time. So many outside sources are determined to put us into corners for the convenience of their own narrative, and until we somehow manage to take over the world, that's unlikely to change. But just as Irish cinema eventually managed to break out and swim against the current of popular opinion, I can only hope that Irish games will eventually do the same in the AAA sector. There have been some seeds sown already, and I'm very interested to see what they blossom into.